I wasn't quite, I guess I'm going to kind of start with what is probably a pretty obvious thing to most of us, but I think it's something that we lose sight of and kind of needs to be kept very much front and center. You know, we're talking about Christianity and food and the Christian perspective on food, and so I want to start by taking a look at a few passages, words from Scripture, from our Hebrew Christian, Judeo-Christian background, and see what it says. The first is from Genesis 1, part of the creation story, which I think is stating, again, what many of us may think is the obvious, but it's something that gets lost all the time, I think, in the actual distribution of, producing of, and sharing of food, and that is stated here. God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, and you shall have them for food. And every beast of the earth, and every bird of the air, and everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. I guess as I started thinking about this, you know, food is for feeding people. And you say, well, of course, that's an assumption, but I think sometimes it's a little bit like, you know, playing golf. The most important thing is keeping your eye on the ball, and it's often the most difficult. And I just want to play this out a little bit. There's a lot of other aspects, perspectives, but I just want to focus on this one today and then see how, I guess, touch on, I did a sabbatical in 2010 around the theme of "Quién es mi prójimo?" Who is my neighbor? Focusing on getting to know the stories of our nearest and most numerous neighbors from Latin America, both the ones living south of the Rio Grande River as well as the ones who have come to live around us and among us. And in the course of that, I delved into the history as much as I possibly could. I'm still certainly not an authority on that, but I just wanted to share some of the insights, and I think they begin relating to this. So, food is produced, is created by God for the sake of feeding, and not just people, but all of creation. You know, it's interesting if you take this very, very literally. You know, even the animals are supposed to just be eating plants, should be vegetarian, I guess, is kind of a literal reading of that. But go on to the next slide. I think sometimes the Christian perspective has gone in a different direction. Maybe it's characterized by this reading from the Old Testament, Genesis 12. "I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great." And then Genesis 13, "Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold." I do think that there is a mentality out there, you know, promoted oftentimes through Christianity, both overtly or maybe not so overtly, that being chosen by God, blessed by God, you know, saved, and all of that means that we have kind of been selected out and charged, and then God is going to help us get rich. God is going to help me be, you know, wildly successful in my business. God is going to multiply my profits beyond all of my wildest expectations. And I think that has an incredible impact on our perspective on food. You know, and so it's easy to get into that and say, well, what is food for? Well, God has given me all of this wonderful ground, all this wonderful land to produce all of this food so that I can sell it at incredible prices, make a great profit, and become incredibly wealthy. And that is a sign that I am favored by God, and God loves me more than the poor schnooks who aren't in this situation. It's a different perspective, but it's out there. It is there, I think. It's awfully hard not to find that at times. So you go back. What is food really for? And it's just a couple other passages. Next one. Reading from Leviticus, I believe this is the one. From Leviticus 19. You know, what was the perspective? What was food for back in the Old Testament times? "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyards bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God." The people in the original Levitical laws that were given back in Old Testament times before Christ We're instructing people not to harvest every last grain, every last bit of everything to produce as much profit for themselves as possible. They were to leave some out there. They were to be kind of sloppy farmers, you know, if you want to say. They were to be mindful that that food was there for the feeding of people, for the feeding of all of creation, and make some available. I mean, we use different systems for doing that now to make sure people have access to food. This was the system that was in place back in those times, and I think it's a fascinating, wonderful concept. And of course plays out in the book of Ruth, when Ruth and Naomi comes back with Naomi, her mother-in-law, and she's needing to somehow sustain herself and has no access to food. She is doing exactly that. She goes to the fields of a guy named Boaz and collects the leftovers, does the gleaning, and they subsist on that. So, again, back to the main point, food is for the feeding of the hungry and for the providing of nourishment for people. That's the first primary purpose of food, as I find it, according to the Christian perspective. Next one, please. You know, going into the New Testament, you know, these parables, there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. I wonder if in life which of those felt that they were blessed by God. You know, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if the rich man didn't say, "Wow, God, you're really being tremendously good to me. Look at this, how you're taking." You know, obviously, as the story goes on, if you can look it up in Luke 16. At the end, it's very clear that God's compassion goes out to the poor and not to the rich man. And I mean, the point of this isn't to figure out what's going to happen in the afterlife to the poor and the rich and all of that. It's to point to a value. What is supposed to be happening here that isn't, and that is that the poor Lazarus, who's hungering at the gate, is meant to be receiving the food, the nourishment that Lazarus needs in order to live, in order to thrive, in order to be sustained. And it should not be being hoarded by the rich man, who is obviously over-consuming a bit. Don't know if there is an obesity problem there. Probably was. There might have been. Can't really say for sure. But again, evidence. Food is for the feeding of hungry people, for the nourishing of needy life forms. Okay, next one, please. And then there's a classic, of course, that reading from Matthew 25 that so many of us are aware of. It seems like we always end up there. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, inherit the kingdom prepared for you." I kind of pulled out and condensed a little bit here. "From the foundations of the world, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink." Goes on about visiting me in prison, clothing me when I was naked, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And then they're astonished. Then the righteous will answer, "Lord, when was it that I saw you hungry and gave you food, thirsty and gave you something to drink?" And the response, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Lifting out, we talk about charity and all kinds. I think it goes beyond that. I think it goes to the, and we'll get into that, but it's pointing the purpose of food is not to be used as a political weapon or a weapon in war, or simply turned into a commodity which is primarily there to generate the maximum amount of profits. It is for the feeding of God's creatures, human beings and others as well. I believe it's there. I see it. That's my absolute conviction that this is the primary first purpose. And of course, as you have an economy that is diverse, and not everybody is raising their own food, you've got to have people who are producing it, transporting it, making it available, preparing it, fairly compensated. But still, the goal is the same. And when I think that goal gets switched, gets moved, and something else becomes the goal, the using of food for something other becomes more important than the providing of food to the hungry, to the ones who need the nourishment. Something gets terribly twisted. And worked. Next one, please. Yeah, just a word again from Acts 2, early Christian community. Awe came upon everyone. This was immediately shortly after Pentecost, because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles, and all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Not necessarily suggesting that's the same methodology we need to use today. It probably won't work. If you read on in Acts, you find out that this system had its problems. Some of them felt that certain widows felt that they were getting shortchanged, while others were getting more than their fair share. So every system has its problems, but the concern, the central concern there, is that the people who needed the food were getting it and had sufficient for their needs. Yeah, then please. And finally, which I guess the thing I'm raising is economic interests, the profit motives. No one can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. I certainly, again, based on some of my observations, my reading and experiences in Latin America, and just life in general, and the kind of the heading or the byline for my talk was for a fair food fight, the hunger for profits versus the hunger for nutrition, the hunger for food. I believe that hunger for profits is huge. And is driving all kinds of things, and not saying that you have to, not an anti-capitalist, or free market totally, but gosh, there's got to be something there to provide some balance, or unfettered greed. I'm sorry, I might be afraid of the incompetence of government, and might be afraid of a lot of things, but I think unfettered greed is is probably the thing I fear more than anything. Just looking at a few other things, I am Gary Teske, pastor at Trinity Lutheran Church, down just right on bordering South Park. Lutheran comes from a guy named Martin Luther, who is generally credited with having triggered the beginning of what was called the Protestant Reformation, by nailing a bunch of concerns that he had and he wanted to discuss and work for reform on the castle church door in a city called Wittenberg in 1517. And he had some interesting things to say, just looking back at some of the early 500 years ago, some of the Christian thinkers. He said, the second virtue of a prince, after allowing a free course for proclaiming the gospel, is to help the poor, the orphans, and the widows to justice and to further their cause. For so to help a man so that he does not need to become a beggar is just as much a good work and a virtue and an alms as to give to a man who has already become a beggar. Really appreciate it. He's writing that as part of his commentary on Psalm 82. And he really did think there should be no beggars. I mean, we have them all over. Walk down Mass Street. He said, we should be coming together under that Christian cause of making sure that all hungry people have sufficient food to eat, have the nutrition they need, that there shouldn't be anyone in need of begging. I think that's an interesting thought. I'm not sure what that means in terms of working out the details, the plan of action, you might say, but I think the value, the focus, the purpose is pretty clearly reflected there. Looking at a little more modern day, the next slide, please. We were part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, who had a social statement on economic life, and they begin by saying, out of deep concern for those affected adversely, we are the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, a part of the Christian community, here assess economic life today in light of the moral imperative to seek sufficient, sustainable livelihood for all. I could spend the rest of the afternoon going into sufficient, not excessive, sustainable, not a little bit, or just thinking short-term, livelihood, well-being, and that final word is probably the biggest, for all. If any of you have ever thought about it, that the Lord's Prayer does not have a single first-person singular pronoun in it. It's not my Father, it's our Father. It's not give us this day, give give me this day my daily bread. It's give us this day our daily bread. Certainly reflects, again, I think it reinforces that concern, that we are concerned with there being food. And at this point, it's more of a complex thing than just running around, and it talks about dealing with systems, with values first and foremost, with spirituality, and with a common vision, shared vision, of sufficiency, sustainability, livelihood, and not just for my tribe, not just for my nation, not just for my denomination, but for all, it being absolutely inclusive. A couple of things that are included in that statement that I thought might be worth sharing. Market-based thought and practices dominate our world today in ways that seem to eclipse other economic, social, political, and religious perspectives. To many people, the global market economy feels like a free-running system that is reordering the world with few external checks or little accountability to values other than profit. I don't know, I think, we can skirt around that, but I think that's fairly accurate in an awful lot of the arenas, awful lot of the places that I take stop to take a look at. There's often some nice sounding words going around, but that is, I think, far too often the reality. Go on to the next one. Who we are in Christ places us in tension with priorities given to money, consumption, competition, and profit in our economic system. I find that, I don't know if you do, in terms of actually trying to live out my life, and I'm not pointing to fingers, I wrestle, I find it within here, not out there. I mean, I can point and condemn and label people, but I have to confess that I wrestle with the spiritual forces that keep tempting and encouraging me to consume, to compete, and especially to increase profits, even though I'm in, I guess you'd call it the religious industry of a sort. So next one, please. While economic growth often is considered an unconditional good, we insist that such growth must be evaluated by its direct, indirect, short-term, and long-term effects on the well-being of all creation and people, especially those who are poor. Looking at, what is food for? What's the purpose of food? I keep coming back to that. It's for it is placed here in the first place by God so that all people can have sufficient food to thrive, for well-being, to live. Go ahead with the next one, please. A look at Latin America. Again, I don't have all the details. I've read, I'm drawing some of this from a book, not all of it, but some, and I have a couple of readings from Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano. He's got a definite slant, you might say ideological slant that I take issue with some of it myself, but he does provide an awful lot of solid, accurate information. And sometimes by looking at something that went on long ago or in a different part of the world and seeing what's happening there, once you look back at your own context, your own world, your own society, your own age, and you see things that you didn't see before, that you've just come to assume or take for granted or become familiar with, so familiar that you just, you don't even question it. Particularly going back to the time of the conquistadors. The immigrants from Europe began arriving. Obviously we know Christopher Columbus, 1492, shortly after that coming in. And the system that quickly fell into place was that the peninsulars coming from Europe, particularly Spain, Portugal, although other parts of Europe as well, were entrusted, many of them became encomenderos. An encomienda is a charge, a mission. In other words, large tracts of Latin America were given, the land and all of the people on it, to an individual, kind of as a fiefdom almost, and that person became an encomendero. He became the one who was in charge of all of that, and basically that person was charged with turning all of the people into Christians, It's not a pretty part of our Christian heritage, because the methodologies used on that were not always exactly gracious or gospel-centered. And the other thing was to take advantage of that land and the population to generate as much profit as possible to ship back to Europe. Because Spain was involved in a war, and they were just needing every cent they could get. They were borrowing like crazy from all over Europe, and was needing a constant flow of silver and gold and every other form of wealth they could get in order to pay their debts and stay afloat. And so, yeah, speak of the word exploitation, that was what was going on. Hacendados, they were the landowners of the haciendas, the large landowners with basically the same kind of a charge. It was going on with the mines, Potosí, the silver mines in Venezuela, and Bolivia, and as gold mines in various parts of the country. But what I saw as I read, and then as I spent some time in Mexico City and in Cuernavaca and so on, was an overseas countries that were desperately in need of profits, really simply organizing the land and the people for the sake of generating as much revenue as possible to be shipped back to Europe. And obviously the abuse, working the indigenous peoples to death, finally became so short of labor, partly because of the diseases, but also partly because they were so abusive of the people that they had to start importing slaves to provide the work, the labor force that they needed to continue to do that. And it's kind of an extreme case, you might say, but it was definitely, it happened, and I think it's still happening. Just a couple of notes. Many of you know about Cortez. Cortez was the one who was the general who conquered the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan, in what is now Mexico City. He later ended up down in Cuernavaca. There's a castle down there. That was his castle. He was received 23,000 vassals, along with a huge chunk of land. These vassals were given to him as encomiendas, as the charge to him. He became their encomendero, and again, he worked for his own wealth, but also to generate for the sake of the profits to be sent overseas. It didn't just happen with the gold and the silver. That's probably the most notorious, but I guess what I was really getting at then, yes, no, you can leave that there yet, is it also happened in terms of crops. In Latin America, the cash crops just took over and became, the only thing that was concerned, the primary concern. For instance, sugar. Just a brief word here. Sugar had destroyed the northeast of Brazil. The humid coastal fringe, well watered by rains, and had a soil of great fertility, rich in humus and mineral salts, and covered by forests from Bahia to Sierra. This region of tropical forest was turned into a region of savannas. Naturally fitted to produce food, it became a place of hunger. Where everything had bloomed exuberantly, the destructive and all-dominating latifundios left sterile rock, washed out soil, eroded lands. At first there had been orange and mango plantations, but these were left to their fate or reduced to small orchards surrounding the sugar mill owner's house, reserved exclusively for the family of the white planter. Fire was used to clear the land for cane fields, on down, disappeared, all was sacrificed on the altar of the sugar monopoly. And just one example of sugar becoming, everything was sacrificed and the production of food crops for the sake of the sugar. Similar things could be said about the planting and production of cocoa, of coffee, of tobacco, of rubber. Just go to product after product. Where I think the thing that food is there for the sake of feeding the hungry, land is used to produce the food for the sake of providing nutrition, food for the hungry, somehow got set aside with the drive to plant whatever, produce whatever is going to generate the most profits. I think that's a principle that we still really have to question and check in on, which is which of the value systems is at work currently in our own context. The next one, And not cash crops versus food crops. That's what I was just talking about. Or taking food crops and viewing them strictly as cash crops without the vision back there that the ultimate goal is to make sure that food is getting distributed to everyone who needs it. I'm certainly not saying that people who produce it should not be fairly compensated, but somehow I think in many instances we put ourselves in a situation where the cash side of that crop is more important than the food, the food production and the human service part of that crop. Next one, please. Cow plus coffee equals tired turf. I spent about 10 years in a country called Papua New Guinea, serving back in the mountains of that country with the Lutheran Church of that country. And one of the things that happened while I was there is that coffee was introduced as a crop. They did not do the big land redistribution that happened in so many countries, which is good. But they had a wonderful system there. The cow, the main staple food in that country was sweet potato. And the Melanesian pidgin word for that is cow. The Anglo word was ain or mapu. But anyway, they had a wonderful system of they'd have one field which was in production they were eating from, one that was newly planted and was growing, one kind of in mid-growth because it was fairly high in the mountains and it could take months for a sweet potato plant to mature. And then they had the ground lying fallow, just resting, as we've talked about some, waiting for it to become fertile again, to be rejuvenated so they could plant again. And then coffee came in. And so people needed to start planting their little coffee plots to generate it. So what land got used to plant the coffee? Well, somehow the land that normally would have gotten its rest time, lay fallow for a time, well, suddenly that pushed it and it became necessary to start planting coffee on those and it restricted the amount of land, and so you had less time for the turf, for the soil to lie fallow and to rejuvenate. I'm not against people planting coffee. I'm not against, I'm happy for the income that many of those receive from that, what they're able to do with it. But again, I think it raises the question, cash crop versus food crop. I just think in terms of our witness, our advocating, kind of the first thing is to keep in mind what was food originally placed here for. Why does God continue to allow the food to grow and to be here? First and foremost for the sake of feeding, providing nourishment for people, for the creation, for all of creation, and that needs to continue. In my way of thinking, that the overarching goal, the primary concern, and all of the other factors we have kind of fit in is in terms of supporting and working toward coming together around that goal, rather than, be blunt, the goal that I think so often takes over is generating maximum income and sacrificing whatever, people in terms of receiving the income that they need, or restricting food, turning it into an economic commodity, strictly speaking, a weapon of war, doing so many of the other things with food that we do. One of the things I'll just close with is the people I was among traditionally had never washed, it was just not part of the culture, and they didn't brush their teeth. And one day in the little trade stores out there where I was at, suddenly toothbrushes showed up, and nobody knew what to do with them. And so I began seeing people walking around wearing toothbrushes on a string. They were wearing them as necklaces, as a decoration, a decorative thing, until... I guess I'm kind of saying a little bit of the same thing here. Let's make sure we don't forget what food is for, and that we don't start using it for other purposes that might seem nice and handy and good and be self-serving and other things. Food is for the feeding of the people and the hungry creation of which we are a part. And I just think, as a Christian perspective, that's the starting point for all the rest of the conversation.